Hello and welcome to another tutorial. I do hope you're doing well today. Today we're going to be looking at some of the materials in Unit 17 of the Harmony course for the Level 9 Harmony covered through the Royal Conservatory of Music. And this material will be helpful to discuss and understand a little bit more about chorales and chorale writing. So what we're going to do is go over to share the screen, and also I will go over to the piano and play a couple of things as well. Now, basically, the chorales that we will be studying and looking at in this tutorial is just this information is just an overview, but at the same time, it really helps to create kind of the highlight or the pinnacle of this course. All of the different videos speaking about tonal hierarchy, chord changes, voice leading best practices, topics such as tonicization or secondary dominant chords, and also modulation are all found in the chorales. And the chorales are so important in relation to the rules and regulations and the structure of Western music, so much so that I find it personally so interesting that when they were written, they were somewhat forgotten for a little while, but then many years later, after Bach's death, the chorales were found again, and there was such a treasure trove of information that was discovered. Something that's really interesting about the chorales that they were actually hymn settings of hymn tunes from the German Protestant or Lutheran Church, and basically the hymns themselves were traditionally sung just as a solo piece, with a cantor or a singer that would lead the congregation in song during church services. But Bach didn't want just to have solo music. He was always interested in innovation and creating new and exciting things. And so what he did was he took those original pieces and he took the tune of the music and then harmonized it. And so that's the amazing thing here, is that he took such an interesting melody, such as this piece here, and then he would recreate a four-part piece with beautiful harmonies and other varying things inside. So some of the characteristics of chorales that are very important to discover are that they're usually harmonically dense. This means that the pieces are usually sung or performed very slowly or at a moderately slow tempo. But at the same time, there are so many different moving parts supporting the melody that basically there are chord changes that occur basically every quarter note. As well, there are important elements to help understand the phrasing within a chorale. There are such things as fermatas, which are these little symbols that I'll circle here. There's one here and one here. These signify the phrase endings. So the tune that I just played sounds very simple, doesn't it? But let me change this camera angle to play the full version of the piece and also include all of the beautiful harmony underneath. It's just so rich. It's just so interesting. And you can see how there are multiple voices. We have soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. And each voice has an intricate moving part, but all of the parts move in harmony or in conjunction with each other. Passing tones and stepwise motion, neighbor tones, and other non-chord tones really help to increase and enhance the smoothness. Sometimes Bach also uses suspensions, where if we remember what a suspension is, that is a non-chord tone that is sustained from a previous chord and then moves to, when a chord change happens to move to something else, the non-chord tone from the previous chord stays and then is resolved. So there are some very interesting non-chord tones that he uses, especially in the harmonic um, support of each of the other voices. Traditionally, the melodic shape within a chorale is simple. The melody moves by step, especially in the soprano, and all of the other voices move in conjunction. The only voice that moves and jumps around a lot, or somewhat more than the other voices, is the bass part, because sometimes we have to outline the varying chord changes, including if there are various chord changes that are on in root position. Something else that's very important as well is that there are some idiomatic or stylistic cadences. Sometimes the cadential 6/4 or V6/4/5/3 is commonly used. As well, we can also see sometimes the V6/4/7/3. So I will notate these right here, V6/4/5/3, or sometimes V6/4/7/3. Sometimes as well, there's the V8/7. There are various different cadences that are created. And this all comes down to the melodic shape. How is the melody created and organized? And then how can the harmonies support that melody? Something else that's very interesting is that with predominant chords, Bach uses both the 4 chord and also the 2/7 interchangeably. It's not really where he chooses to use one type of chord or another type of chord. He actually equally uses both. But if I were to say if there was one chord that was more popular than the other, he uses the 2/7 more frequently. But because it's just got such a beautiful sound. If we think of the 2/7 chord in the key of, let's say, D major, we have the D major scale. The 2 chord would be on E, E, G, B. The 2/7 chord would include E, G, B, and D. Now, if we were to compare the 2/7 chord with the 4 chord, the 4 chord would be G, B, D, and the 2/7 chord is E, G, B, D. Both chords actually contain common notes. And so sometimes the 4 chord can be used if there's more of a major sound that Bach wants to create. And the 2/7 chord can also be used as well because the notes are basically the same. Something that's really interesting, though, is that the 2 chord, the 2/7 chord in particular, can be used as a common chord when using pivot chord to change key to a new scale. Because sometimes the 2 chord in one key is another chord, like there could be a 6 chord in another key. So it's really interesting how Bach can do that. Something that's also very common is Bach also can use a V6/5 of 5 or a dominant 7th of a dominant chord as a predominant. So what he actually does is he then changes the harmonic language very slightly right prior to the cadence, but without altering the sound of the phrase. So in other words, if we were to look at this example 11.6, the melody here goes like this. Again, fairly simple. But if we notate the information here, you can see how there's a V6/5 going to then a V8/7 So a V6-5 of 5 going to a V8-7 going to 1. And this is just beautiful in the way that it sounds. Let me now play it on the piano, and I'll switch cameras. So you can hear how the V6-5 of 5 is very subtle. And this actually can be a reharmonization of what would also be known as the 2-6-5. In the key of A major, the 2 chord would be B, D, F, and then if we think of 2-7 as B, D, F, A, that would be the diatonic 2-7 chord in that scale. But what Bach actually does is he changes the D to a D sharp, and automatically, all of a sudden, it's a dominant 7th of 5. So the rest of the notes are all part of the scale, except for the D sharp, which is an added accidental, which changes the harmonic language and slightly changes the sound. But if we were to take away the D sharp and just play it as a 2-6-5 chord, it also would work perfectly as a predominant. So it's interesting how Bach can sometimes use these varying little switches and intricate parts in his language, but also we can see the richness of the quality in his chord changes. And so that's why his music is so important to study. Sometimes Bach also uses a passing diminished 7th in first inversion, also known as 1 going to 7-6 going to 1-6. This is a very nice progression to create smooth voice leading by step, in which the voices either are going up in the bass like so, and then the voices are moving down by step in the higher voices, the upper voices, soprano and alto. Something else that's interesting is that in a minor scale, Bach chooses to use the tierce de Picardie, which is also known as switching at the very end of a piece from the minor final tonic chord to the tonic major. So for example, in the scale of E minor, he would switch the last chord from E minor to E major. And so that really creates kind of an uplifting ending to a phrase, or especially to the end of a chorale. Let me play this example, 17.10, and you'll hear how it's very much in a minor key, but at the end there's a nice little uplift with that tierce de Picardie. Let me switch over the camera again and play. Let me play one more time. So you can really hear that there's a very nice ending to that particular phrase. Now, something that is also interesting when looking at Bach chorales is how sometimes Bach uses 2 different ways to handle or to work with modulation. The most common way, of course, that we've studied is the use of the pivot chord, and how the pivot chord is a bridge between one scale and another. So if you want to have, let's say, if you want to think about your closely related keys and you want to go from the key of C major to the key of G major, you would then think about any chords that are the same between those 2 scales and use them as a pivot chord. So for example, in the scale of C major. The C chord is the same. It's the four. That's the chord 4 in G major. D minor doesn't exist because there has to be a sharp, an F sharp. E minor, which is the 3 chord, can also be the 6 chord in G major. F doesn't work. G major is the tonic chord in G and also the dominant chord in C. A minor is the 2 chord in G and also the 6 chord in C. So there are a few different options. And so what Bach usually does is he picks through the various a couple of hundred chorales that are available to us, we start to see that there are common things that Bach does when he chooses to go from one modulation or one key to another and practices his modulation techniques. And one thing that he does very commonly is he chooses strong chords from the original scale to transition into the new scale. And also, the modulation usually happens right prior to a set of changes of accidentals. Of course, because then this can confirm the new key prior to it starting. So if we look at this example here, the first bar is in the key of G major, which is the key of the original. But then by the time we get to here, where I will circle this chord, the 5 chord in the key of G is also the 1 chord in the scale of D major. And then he transitions into this scale until the cadence in the new key here. And you can see how, as well, something that Bach does is he confirms this key right here with a nice V8 7 to 1 cadence to really solidify that new key. That's a good practice when working on the chorales and doing your own harmonization, because whenever there is a possibility for modulation, you always want to make sure to confirm that new key with a cadence, just to create a sense of closure when we go from one scale to another. Then what Bach does is he then transitions back to the scale of G major at the cadence. This is sometimes fairly rare, but it does exist. And sometimes as well, the new key might be established for a couple of chords, and then you can also modulate back. There's 2 options there. Sometimes Bach also does a second way of modulation in which he finishes off in a new scale with the modulation, with the cadence, but then starts fresh in a new key without any pivot chord or any kind of semblance of confirming a transition. That usually happens right directly after a phrase. So now, something that is also important is to see when you're looking at a chorale and you want to analyze it, and we can slide through to a couple of the examples later on. If we were to turn over a couple of different pages in our book and travel along to, I believe we're looking at page 213 right now. Something that you want to do for each example is look at the phrase shape and see the direction of the melody. And as well, if there's a bass given, you want to see what chord changes there are. Now on page 213, these short examples are all provided with chord changes. But if we were to look at page 214, you can see here, now we're starting to get into some more tricky territory, because we have the melodic shape and then the outline of the chords with some modulations. But then we get into other musical sentences such as this, where the only information we have that's given is the soprano line and the bass, but nothing else. So when you're looking at an example like this, what you want to do is see what the melodic shape is and decide which key you're in. And then from there, you want to, I would suggest confirming the cadence first, and then working through to find each chord change that works logically, and then fill in the voices afterwards. When we start looking at a couple of other examples, like we have on the middle of page 215, you can see here there's no bass at all, just the melody. And so that makes things a little bit tricky too, doesn't it? Because then we have to think about not only the melodic shape, but also what possible chords could be used. And then the um, the pinnacle is answering the questions while seeing how sometimes there is music at the beginning with all the voices, and then sometimes the bass is given, and other times we have melody alone. So there are various techniques that can be used to accomplish this. Something you want to think about is again always looking for the end of the phrases and to count how many phrases there are, and then see which key center each phrase lands in. That's very important. After that, then if there, you see there's a modulation, that will be, of course, something to handle when we get there so that you can master the modulation and make sure to confirm it with a strong cadence. As well, when you're looking at some of these questions, sometimes students think, boy, oh boy, there's so many options. Which chord should I use first? And that's where then it's good to go through the tonal hierarchy. Think about your strong chords and which chords can work more frequently. As well, are there any sequences in the phrasing, and which kind of structural chord progressions could work based on what is provided as well. Then, as soon as you start to see that, each phrase will start to make sense. For example, in this piece here, the second phrase I would say goes into the key of E major. So then you can say, okay, where would the pivot chord be? Where's the cadence? And then confirm in the key of E. That's organized. But then you have to think, okay, this might be here, a half cadence in the key of A major, and then potentially then an authentic cadence in the key of A major as well. So by looking at the bigger picture and seeing how the phrasing works, that helps to parse out some of the details for answering the questions. Something else that I would recommend if you've gotten all the way through to the end of this video, and thank you for watching and enjoying it with me, is if you could please like and subscribe and share this information with others. That would be amazing. I really have a passion for music theory, and I really enjoy helping others with mastering the various skills. And something that I might recommend you do as well is to go back through the textbook and just revisit some of the various tutorials that I've created as well on such things as tonal hierarchy, modulation, and also secondary dominant chords, because this will be hugely helpful when figuring out what chords will work best when answering your chorale questions. This overview is more of a way to explain and see the language of what Bach was writing, so that when you're answering your questions, we can start to use the same kind of language in our own writing as well. Thank you so very much for viewing this tutorial, and I do hope you have a great day, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.